Capitalism didn't begin as a dark conspiracy. It began as a moral and economic project, rising with the morning light over Europe. In the 18th century, a new commercial society emerged as markets, merchants, and money started to reshape everyday life across Europe. At the heart of this new world was a simple, dangerous question: what really creates wealth in a society? Adam Smith believed the answer lay not in gold or kings, but in labor, the ordinary work of ordinary people. In 1776, he published The Wealth of Nations, building on ideas from his 1759 theory of moral sentiments, and showed how dividing work into tiny tasks could multiply output. For Smith, a fair wage wasn't charity, it was the minimum that allowed workers to live with dignity and maybe a little comfort. He imagined an impartial spectator inside us, a moral voice asking whether how we treat the poor would still seem just if we were born in their place. A century later, Karl Marx looked at the same factories and asked a harsher question: who keeps the part of value workers never see? Marx called it surplus value, the portion of what workers produce that they are never paid, quietly transformed into profit. He argued that within this system lay the seeds of crisis, as capital chased profit faster than wages or demand could keep up. Boom and bust, overproduction and panic were for Marx not accidents but recurring patterns baked into the logic of capitalism. Then came the Great Depression. Between 1929 and 1933, U.S. output fell by almost a third, and unemployment hit about 25%, 1 in 4 workers without a job. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes responded with the general theory, insisting that markets could get stuck with mass unemployment and simply stay there. He spoke of effective demand, the total spending in the economy, and warned that when it falls short, factories fall silent and workers are left idle. His answer was controversial: a far bigger role for the state, what critics dismissed as big government stepping into the market. Public works, deficit spending, and jobs programs, he argued, could act as a bridge over the chasm of mass unemployment. But another voice warned that the same bridge might lead somewhere darker if planning the economy became a permanent habit. In 1944, Friedrich Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom, warning that even well-meant economic control could slowly erode personal freedom. He believed that prices in a free market carry millions of tiny pieces of information that no planner, however brilliant, could ever fully know. From Smith to Marx, Keynes to Hayek, capitalism turned into a battlefield of ideas about growth, justice, and power. Each thinker saw a different threat: deep poverty, exploitation, mass unemployment, or an overreaching state that crushed liberty. And yet their arguments still echo today whenever we argue about growth targets, welfare programs, debt ceilings, or regulation. But in the background, the machinery of capitalism has quietly changed, shifting from smokestacks and shipyards to screens and servers. To uncover its uncomfortable truth, we now have to stop looking at factories and start following the invisible flow of money itself. Once most wealth came from things you could touch: factories, farms, ships loaded with grain and coal. Today, more and more wealth is made not from producing goods, but from moving money and risk around the globe. We call this financial capitalism, profit built on leverage, speculation, and layers of complex financial products. The real economy still matters, but finance now sits in the driver's seat, steering where capital flows and who gets it. We're often told a simple story: when governments print money, higher prices are sure to follow. The quantity theory links money, prices, and output in a tidy formula, MV equals PY, like an equation that explains everything. Over the long run, there is truth in it. Countries whose money supply grows much faster than output tend to suffer higher inflation. But in a crisis, the equation breaks, the velocity of money collapses, and cash hides in bank accounts instead of changing hands. In modern economies, most new money is created not by the government's printing press, but by commercial banks issuing loans. Fractional reserve banking lets banks lend many times more than the cash they actually keep locked in their vaults. In a textbook example with a 10% reserve ratio, a single $1,000 deposit can, through repeated lending, support up to $10,000 in deposits. That is why on classroom whiteboards, a 10% reserve implies a money multiplier of about 10. Every dollar of base money becoming 10 on paper. Reality is messier. Capital requirements, regulation, and fear all limit how far this multiplier can run. Even so, our entire system rests on ever-expanding credit, on the assumption that tomorrow's income will pay off today's debts. Every loan must eventually be repaid, and not just the principal, but interest on top. That raises a troubling question. Where does the extra money to pay all that interest actually come from? Critics argue that the system survives only if there is constant growth, steady inflation, or painful defaults somewhere in the chain. Economist Hyman Minsky warned that long periods of calm actually encourage risk-taking, quietly sowing the seeds of the next storm. As fragile bets pile up in the shadows, a single shock can turn a small problem into a systemic crisis. At the center of this highly leveraged world sits one currency above all others: the US dollar. Since Bretton Woods in 1944, the dollar has been the planet's main reserve currency, still making up about 58% of disclosed foreign exchange reserves in 2024. The institution managing that currency, the Federal Reserve, is both deeply public and strangely private at the same time. Its Board of Governors in Washington is a government agency, but the 12 regional reserve banks are owned by member banks and pay them a fixed 6% dividend. In a financialized world, whoever controls how dollars are created and destroyed holds power that can shape crises, rescues, and the fate of entire nations. What if capitalism doesn't just move in short business cycles, but in giant waves that last an entire lifetime? Russian economist Nikolai Kondratiev spoke of long waves, 40 to 60-year surges and slowdowns in the capitalist system. Each wave, he argued, was powered by new clusters of technology: steam engines, electricity, automobiles, computers, and beyond. At the crest comes a boom. Then, as each technology matures, economies slide into long, grinding downturns. Not every economist buys the theory, but the pattern of rise, stagnation, and crisis feels eerily familiar. The uncomfortable question is, on today's wave, are we still climbing or already heading down the other side? Deflation is another structural threat in a world built on debt, a slow poison rather than a sudden shock. Falling prices sound like good news for shoppers, but the amounts owed on mortgages and loans do not fall with them. The Great Depression and Japan's lost decades show how deflation can trap an economy. Japan's real GDP grew barely about 1% a year, prices hovered near zero, and real wages fell by roughly 10 to 13% over 2 decades. When people expect prices to fall, they delay spending. When firms expect weak demand, they delay investing, and the spiral feeds on itself. At the same time, modern capitalism has turned our emotions themselves into a marketplace. Anxiety, loneliness, and low self-esteem become fuel for unconscious consumption as we buy to soothe feelings rather than meet needs. Algorithms quietly learn what scares us and what excites us, sometimes better than we understand ourselves. With every swipe and click, they nudge us toward instant pleasure today and long-term debt tomorrow. Behavioral economics shows that we naturally discount future pain. A small reward now feels worth a much larger cost later. Banks and marketers understand these biases well and design credit cards, loans, and apps to fit neatly around them. High turnover investment funds can generate steady fees even when the people who invest in them lose money. By mid-2008, the notional value of over-the-counter derivatives reached around $680 trillion, more than 10 times world GDP, a tower of bets dwarfing the real economy. When U.S. house prices started to fall, mortgage derivatives turned a local housing bubble into a global financial crisis. Products that had been sold and rated as safe suddenly revealed risks no one had truly priced in. Banks earned fees all along the way. When the system collapsed, taxpayers paid for the bailout and the cleanup. The danger in the end lies not only in complex numbers, but in human incentives and the way they are wired. When profits are tied to complexity and opacity, true transparency becomes a threat to the business model itself. All these structural risks set the stage for the next experiment in crisis management, the age of quantitative easing. When policy interest rates slammed into zero after the crisis, central banks reached for a new and untested weapon. They called it quantitative easing, QE, an innocuous name for a radical experiment. Instead of cutting short-term rates further, they created money to buy long-term government bonds and other assets. By bidding up bond prices and pushing down long-term yields, QE was meant to encourage borrowing, investment, and spending. In the United States, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet jumped from under $1 trillion before 2008 to about $4.5 trillion by 2014 and nearly $9 trillion by 2022. Many observers warn that such money creation would eventually end in runaway, even hyperinflation. Yet in most rich countries, consumer prices stayed surprisingly calm for years, often below the central bank's own targets. The real inflation showed up elsewhere. Stock markets and house prices in many economies rose far faster than wages or GDP. By driving down yields on safe bonds, QE pushed investors into riskier assets, stocks, corporate debt, and real estate. If you already owned assets, QE felt like a windfall. If you didn't, you watched the elevator go up without you. Inequality, then, is not only about paychecks, it is about who owns the houses, shares, and land that rise in value. On the 0 to 1 Gini scale, U.S. income inequality climbed from the mid-0.3 range around 1980 to roughly 0.48 or 0.49 by 2020, among the highest in the rich world. Some studies argue QE reduced job losses and supported recovery. Others conclude it mainly inflated the portfolios of those at the top. Either way, it changed who gained most from the rebound, tilting the recovery map toward asset owners over wage earners. By 2024, the median price of a U.S. single-family home was about 5 times the median household income. In England, an average home cost roughly 8.6 years of disposable income, up from 4.4 years in 1999. For many middle-class families, that home is their main or even their only significant asset. When housing turns from shelter into a global investment vehicle, it quietly reshapes who can build wealth and who cannot. In country after country, from the UK onward, house prices have risen roughly twice as fast as wages since 2000, widening the gap between owners and renters. Imagine a shock that nudges an inequality index up by just a few hundredths of a point over 3 years. On a graph, it looks tiny, but in real lives, it means millions locked out of ownership. Small statistical changes compounded over time decide who accumulates assets and who is left paying rent forever. Since 1990, the share of humanity living in extreme poverty has fallen from nearly 36% to around 10% by 2015, over 1 billion people crossing the $1.90 a day line. So the uncomfortable truth is not that capitalism has achieved nothing. It has lifted billions, yet it has done so unevenly. Capitalism is not a simple villain or hero. It is a fragile, unequal, deeply human system built on our hopes, fears, and power struggles. The question is whether we can rewrite its rules about money, debt, and ownership before the next great wave crashes into us.